One of the more fascinating conspiracies that between 1969 and 1972, that was the only time in history that a human being has been more than 400 miles above the Earth's surface.
For what feels like forever, the Soviet space program was all hush-hush, with stories of bravery and heartbreak hidden behind the Iron Curtain. But what if one of their most legendary cosmonauts had a secret so scary that it stayed buried for 87 years? Get ready to be mind-blown as Joe Rogan reveals a hidden truth that could totally change how we see space exploration and the human spirit. So what exactly has Joe Rogan revealed, and what does this mean for space exploration? Join us as we discuss this and more: the Cold War and the space race. The Cold War, which went down during the middle of the 20th century, was a time of serious political face-offs. The tension between the United States and the Soviet Union was at an all-time high, with both sides flexing their military and political muscles. But what really cranked up the excitement was the race to explore space. Both countries wanted to prove they were the top dogs in technology. One of the coolest things during this period was the Soviet Union's mission to Mars, adding a whole new layer of mystery to their space efforts. Even though they had already hit some major milestones in space, the Soviets set their sights on the Red Planet, hoping to score another historic win in the space race. After what seemed like a successful landing, everything went eerily quiet, leading to decades of speculation and unanswered questions. Then, Joe Rogan, the well-known podcaster and reporter, came in hot with some wild claims. He spilled the beans on the Soviet Union's findings about UFOs and alien tech. He said, "Team good or team bad? You can call them whatever you want, but seriously, what are these things? Are they good or bad? I think some of them are bad." Of course, the world will never forget Neil Armstrong, the guy who took that iconic first step on the moon, and NASA, the agency that made it happen. But before NASA's epic moment, the Soviet Union was already making waves in space. They were the first to explore the moon's region, though they didn't manage to land a person there. The Soviet Union left a huge mark on space exploration, starting with the launch of the first ever artificial satellite and moving on to sending the first human into space. On October 4th, 1957, they successfully launched Sputnik 1, forever changing history. This first artificial satellite was about the size of a beach ball, 58 centimeters, or about 22.8 inches in diameter, weighed 83.6 kilograms, or 183 pounds, and circled Earth in about 98 minutes. That launch triggered political, military, technical, and scientific breakthroughs on a global scale. Although Sputnik's launch was just one event, it kicked off a whole new space era and sparked the intense space race between the US and the Soviet Union. This tech achievement grabbed the world's attention and stunned Americans. It was way bigger than the Vanguard's expected 3.5-pound payload. On top of that, people started worrying that if the Soviets could launch satellites, they might soon be able to fire ballistic missiles carrying nuclear bombs from Europe to the United States. This was when the space race truly began. The space race gets real. Then the Soviets struck again with Sputnik 2 on November 3, 1957. This time, they sent up a much heavier load, including a dog named Laika. They became the first to successfully launch a living creature into orbit. After Sputnik 1, the US Defense Department quickly responded by putting money into a satellite project. Wernher von Braun and his team at the Army Redstone Arsenal began working on the Explorer project, while also keeping the Vanguard program going. Fast forward to January 31, 1958, and the United States made its own mark in the space race by launching Explorer 1, its very first satellite to orbit Earth. This mission brought along experimental equipment, leading to the incredible discovery of the Van Allen radiation belt, a bunch of charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field. This discovery was a game changer in understanding space weather and the challenges of human space travel. NASA officially came to life on October 1, 1958, marking a big step forward for the U.S.in space exploration. NASA replaced the old National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, NACA, and expanded its role to include not just aeronautics, but space exploration too. This was a huge shift, showing how serious the US was about leading the space game. Then, on December 18, 1958, the U.S. hit another milestone by launching SCORE, the world's first communication satellite. And they didn't stop there. SCORE made history by broadcasting President Dwight D. Eisenhower's pre-recorded Christmas message. This moment captured the world's attention since it was the first time a human voice was broadcast from space, showing just how promising space-based communication could be. Soviet advances continue. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union took a big leap with the launch of Luna 1 on January 2, 1959. Known as the first cosmic rocket, Luna 1 was originally meant to land on the Moon, but thanks to its super-high speed, it zoomed past the Moon and became the first human-made object to leave Earth's orbit and enter a solar orbit. This unexpected twist really showcased the Soviet Union's prowess in space exploration and their contributions to interplanetary missions. Fast forward to August of 1959, and the United States launched the world's first weather satellite, Explorer 6. This mission was a game-changer, capturing the first images of Earth from space. These photos provided vital meteorological data and showed the amazing potential of satellites for Earth observation and weather forecasting, giving us a better grasp of our own planet. In those early years of the space race, both the United States and the Soviet Union were making significant strides, each contributing major tech advances and scientific breakthroughs. The period was marked by rapid development and fierce competition, driving both countries to achieve remarkable feats in space exploration. Then, on September 12, 1959, the Soviet Union hit another milestone with Luna 2, the first spacecraft to actually reach the Moon. Luna 2 crashed into the Moon's surface, sending back valuable data to Earth. The Soviets didn't stop there. They continued their lunar missions with a string of successes. On February 3, 1966, Luna 9 achieved the first soft landing on the Moon and sent back the very first pictures of its surface. The spacecraft that carried the Luna 9 lander capsule weighed 1,538 kilograms and stood about 2.7 meters tall. It started its descent and just before hitting the surface, ejected the lander capsule. This lander weighed 99 kilograms and was a small spheroid automatic lunar station ALSS capsule measuring 58 centimeters or 23 inches. It had a landing bag to absorb the impact, which was traveling at nearly 54 kilometers per hour. The lander was a tightly sealed box packed with radio gear, a timing device, heat management systems, scientific tools, power sources, and a TV camera. This spacecraft was designed by the OKB-1 Bureau under chief designer Sergei Korolev, who sadly passed away before the launch. Luna 16, launched on September 12, 1970, was the first mission to return lunar soil samples to Earth. The Luna 16 station was sent from an initial Earth orbit, and after a mid-course correction on September 13th, it entered a circular 111-kilometer lunar orbit on September 17th. Yuri Gagarin and Soviet human spaceflight. But the biggest space achievement for the Soviet Union happened on April 12, 1961, when Yuri Gagarin became the first human to blast off into space aboard Vostok 1. Gagarin's 118-minute orbit around Earth was a huge moment in history, putting the Soviet Union on the map as a major player in space research. The Soviets then took things up a notch with their human spaceflight program, introducing the Voskhod flights, which included the first multi-person crewed spaceflight in 1964. Gagarin's ride, Vostok 1, zipped around Earth at a mind-blowing 27,400 kilometers per hour. And get this, Vostok's re-entry was controlled by a computer. Unlike early American space missions, Gagarin didn't land inside a capsule. Instead, he ejected from the spacecraft and parachuted down. On April 19, 1971, the Soviet Union launched the world's very first space station, Salyut 1, marking another incredible milestone. Over the next decade, they rolled out 6 upgraded Salyuts with the goal of making a human presence in space a regular thing. Salyut 1 started construction in early 1970 and landed at the Baikonur Cosmodrome nearly a year later. Some final assembly was done at the launch center. Vladimir Komarov, who headed the governmental committee for Soyuz flights, oversaw the Salyut program. The launch was planned for April 12, 1971, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Gagarin's Vostok 1 flight, but technical hiccups delayed it to April 19th. The first crew was launched later on the Soyuz 10 mission, but they ran into trouble and couldn't dock with the station. The mission was cut short, and the crew returned to Earth safely. A replacement crew flew up on Soyuz 11 and stayed aboard for 23 days. This was the first time a space station was actually up and running, setting a new record for time spent in space. Sadly, the achievement was bittersweet. During re-entry, a pressure equalization valve on the Soyuz 11 capsule malfunctioned, leading to the crew's tragic asphyxiation. They were the first, and as of 2023, the only humans who have died in space. After this disaster, missions were paused until the Soyuz spacecraft could be redesigned. The station was eventually destroyed by deorbiting after 6 months in orbit, since it ran out of fuel before a new Soyuz could be launched. Despite this setback, it kicked off a series of successful space station missions, including the famous Mir, which operated for an impressive 15 years from 1986 to 2001. After this, the Soviet Union set out to explore Mars, the Soviet Mars missions. They kicked things off with their Mars 2 and Mars 3 missions, diving into the mysteries of the Red Planet. These missions were all about figuring out what Mars's atmosphere was like, how hot or cold it was, and what the surface was made of. Mars 2 got its start on May 19, 1971, and came with both an orbiter and a lander. Sadly, the lander had a bit of a mishap. It crashed on Mars because its parachute didn't open right. Bummer, right? But on the bright side, the orbiter did its job and sent back some pretty important info from Mars's orbit. Then, on May 28, 1971, the Soviets launched Mars 3, which also had an orbiter and a lander. The orbiter nailed it and made it into Mars's orbit. And on December 2, 1971, the lander made history by being the first spacecraft to land on Mars without crashing. That was a big deal. These missions were designed to brave the long haul of about 200 million kilometers from Earth to Mars. They came with all sorts of gear like landing capsules, brake shields, retro rockets, and parachutes to handle Mars's tough conditions. But the real star of the show was the Prop M rover. This nifty little robot weighed just 5 kilograms and was built to explore Mars like a little astronaut. It had skis for gliding over rough terrain and clever sensors to steer clear of obstacles. What's really cool is that the Soviets were doing autonomous robotic exploration way back in 1971. The Prop M rover, connected to the landing capsule by a 15-meter cable, gave important info about the Martian soil's density, texture, and strength. This was a groundbreaking step for future Mars rovers and set the stage for all the amazing things that followed. Unfortunately, the Prop M rover's mission didn't last long, only about 20 seconds. Mars 2 had a rough landing, but Mars 3 pulled off a historic soft landing, making it the first human-made spacecraft to touch down on Mars. Mars 2 and Mars 3 legacy. This win solidified the Soviet Union's spot as the top contender in the epic space race against the United States. The Mars 2 and Mars 3 missions will always be legendary in the story of Martian exploration. These colossal spacecraft, tipping the scales at about 4,750 kilograms, came with an orbiter and a landing module. They snagged vital info on Mars's atmosphere, soil, and magnetic field using all sorts of gadgets, including cameras and spectrometers. The Soviet Union's ambitious Mars missions really left a mark on the history of space exploration. The Mars 2 and Mars 3 spacecraft were way ahead of their time, packed with cutting-edge tech. What made them stand out even more was their unique lander. This part was built to handle the harsh landing on Mars. The whole landing system was pretty cool. First, a special parachute was deployed to slow down the lander as it entered Mars's atmosphere. Then, a few moments later, retro rockets fired up to ease the landing. It was a well-thought-out plan. Sadly, shortly after landing, Mars 3 suddenly lost contact with its base. But the USSR wasn't ready to throw in the towel. They'd collected a ton of scientific data and tech advancements from their Mars missions and were set on continuing their exploration. Beyond just trying to outdo the United States, the Soviets had bigger dreams. They were determined to crack the mystery of possible life on Mars. The onboard rover wasn't just for studying soil and weather, it was also on the lookout for signs of life. It was a huge moment when Mars 3 sent back the first live image from the red planet. Even though the photo only showed a gray backdrop, it was a huge achievement. While spotting aliens or anything remarkable from that image was nearly impossible, the Soviet Union saw it as a major win. They knew they were trailblazers in exploring the unknown. As incredible as this was for the Soviet Union, something unexpected happened after the Mars 3 mission. When the Mars 3 probe touched down and started sending data back to Earth, it abruptly went silent after just 15 seconds. Nobody had a clue why the transmission suddenly cut off, and the equipment never powered back up. It was a disheartening end to what could have been a groundbreaking project. Since then, several theories have popped up to explain the eerie silence. Some folks think a dust storm on Mars might have been the culprit, while others have jokingly suggested that Martians themselves might have interfered, hinting at alien sabotage. Without any further contact, scientists were left in the dark about what happened to Mars 3 and its rover. Were the Soviets hiding secret space operations from the world? Well, there's reason to doubt them, especially since they never mentioned the Prop M rovers in their official reports. It wasn't until 1990 that this little secret came out, revealing that small robots had actually been sent to Mars. Rumor has it that the Mars 6 and Mars 7 spacecraft might have also carried rovers. Mars has always fascinated astronomers with its massive dust storms that can last for weeks. These storms turn the planet from a dead red ball into a hazy, furious amber sphere. The planet's terrain and atmosphere make it the perfect storm factory. Right before the Mars 3 rover went silent, its cameras captured a gray, stormy backdrop. This led Soviet scientists to believe that a dust storm might have swallowed Mars 3, bringing its mission to an early end. Joe Rogan and the UFO mysteries. So what juicy details did Joe Rogan spill on his show about the Soviet astronaut? Joe Rogan, that well-known American comedian, commentator, and podcast guru, is totally into Cold War history, UFOs, and alien tech. He's had all sorts of experts on his podcast, scholars, authors, even former government insiders. In a recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, Rogan dove into some out-there stuff about alien encounters, dropping some pretty wild material from space that had been kept under wraps. He talked about a video posted by Soviet cosmonaut Ivan Wagner while he was chilling on the International Space Station, ISS. The video was supposed to capture the Southern Lights, but instead, it showed a bunch of UFOs floating around in a weird formation over Earth. The clip quickly blew up on social media, with lots of folks backing up Wagner's claim that these were UFOs. The ISS kept mum on the whole thing, which only made people more curious. Wagner sent the footage in for analysis, but the space agency never replied, leaving us with another cosmic mystery. This whole thing makes you wonder what space agencies might know but aren't spilling to the public. And it's not just this one-off case. Over the years, there have been plenty of whistleblowers and claims suggesting that space agencies, including NASA, have kept some pretty big secrets about alien life. Take the Soviet Union's missions to Venus and Mars, for example. The Venera 13 mission, which launched in 1982, snapped some top-notch pictures of Venus and gathered a ton of data about its surface. The probe even spotted signs of organic chemicals that could hint at biological life forms. So, could there be aliens on Venus? Did the Soviet missions come across alien life during their explorations? The lack of transparency from space agencies about these mind-blowing findings only adds fuel to the fire of curiosity and suspicion. Moon landing conspiracy theories. So if you ever find yourself chatting about whether humans actually landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969, you might be caught off guard. While most of us think it's one of humanity's epic achievements that couldn't possibly be faked by the US government, NASA, the 12 astronauts who walked on the moon, or the 400,000 folks involved in the Apollo program, there are still some people, Joe Rogan for example, who believe it was all a hoax. They argue that the US government made up Apollo 11 and the other missions to give the USSR a major setback in the space race, boost NASA's funding, or distract from the Vietnam War. To back up their claims, conspiracy theorists try to find proof that the landings were staged. One popular theory is that Apollo photos never show any stars. You'd think there'd be a million stars in every astronaut's shot if they weren't blocked by Earth's light pollution and cloudy skies, but this theory is off base. The photos were taken during the moon's daytime. Since the manned missions were during bright, sunny days, the starlight was too weak to show up in the pictures. Another common gripe is that the crosshairs in some Apollo photos sometimes seem to be behind objects. This, they say, means the images must be fake, with the crosshairs painted on. But research on Earth shows that crosshairs can look fainter when viewed against bright objects. Some of this detail gets lost when the photos are copied or scanned, making it look like the crosshair is behind the subject in some shots. And then there's the Apollo 16 mission photo of a moon rock that seems to have a C on it, like a movie prop. But if you check the original photo, there's no C to be found. It's likely just a hair or thread that got stuck during the copying process. A more nuanced defense of the fake landings is based on many misconceptions about NASA technology and lunar physics. One popular piece of this puzzle is the American flag planted by Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. In some photos, it looks like the flag is waving, but since there's no wind on the moon, how can that be? Well, the flag isn't actually waving. It's held out by a horizontal rod, which makes it look like it's fluttering. Plus, the flag doesn't lie completely flat because of the moon's lower gravity. After the astronauts set it up, the flag moved a bit, but then stayed put. Next up, let's talk about the Van Allen belts. The Van Allen belt debate. Some conspiracy theorists think these belts prove the moon landings were fake. They're two giant donut-shaped belts of supercharged particles from solar wind that surround Earth. People worried that traveling through these belts would expose astronauts to deadly radiation. Before the Apollo missions, this was a real concern. So the scientists behind Apollo 11 went all out to protect the astronauts. They wrapped the spacecraft in aluminum to block the radiation and picked a path that kept them in the Van Allen belts for the shortest time possible. On average, the astronauts got a dose of 0.46 rad of radiation, which is way less than what some nuclear plant workers get, but a bit more than what doctors who use X-rays and radiation therapy deal with. Even with all the moon landing conspiracy theories floating around, there's tons of proof that we really did go to the moon. We have over 8,400 publicly available photos from the Apollo missions, tons of video footage, scientific data, and transcripts and audio recordings of every single communication between the astronauts and mission control. On top of that, the Apollo crew brought back 382 kilograms of moon rocks. Labs around the world have confirmed these rocks are truly from the moon. So, any conspiracy theories about a US cover-up just don't hold up. So, what's the reason we haven't been back to the moon since the early 1970s? The simplest answer is that the US government cut NASA's budget, making it too expensive to carry out those high-risk space missions. When you adjust for inflation, the Apollo program alone cost about $260 billion. Even though the Soviet Union was ahead in space exploration at first, they pulled back once the US won the space race. Sergei Korolev, the genius behind the Soviet space program, died in the late 1960s, and with his death, funding for the space program dried up. Without the Cold War rivalry to push them, the US decided not to continue with moon missions. The program was seen as a huge money sink, despite still being popular with the public. NASA's return to the moon. In 2017, the US set a goal to return to the moon and put the first woman on the lunar surface by 2024. NASA is working on plans to get both the first woman and the next man to the moon. However, there's no guarantee the mission will actually happen as planned in the middle of the 2020s. Remember the Constellation Lunar Return project? It was moving forward in the 2000s, but President Obama canceled it in 2010 because of budget issues. If it hadn't been canceled, astronauts might have been back on the moon by 2020. Now, you might wonder why preparing missions like Constellation and Artemis take so long and cost so much money, especially since we managed to travel to the moon back in the 1960s and 70s. After all, we did it several times. This problem today is that a lot of the technology and know-how from those moon missions has been lost. When NASA's funding got cut in 1972, they couldn't keep everything from the Apollo program. They ended up losing some important stuff along the way. One famous blunder was erasing the original raw footage of the moon landing. Even though we still have the live TV broadcast, that early unprocessed footage is gone. Plus, other key items from the lunar missions have disappeared over time. So why is recreating lunar technology so tough? The tech we used back then was incredibly advanced. Sure, we have designs for rockets and lunar modules, but we don't have the same engineers who made those designs a reality. It took a massive team of talented engineers, designers, and physicists to get the Apollo program off the ground. Without them, it's not as simple as just building new lunar modules and Saturn V rockets. In the 2010s, there were efforts to rebuild an F-1 engine from the Saturn V rocket, which was the biggest and most powerful rocket engine ever made. Standing over 360 feet tall, this was no easy feat. Engineers faced all sorts of problems like combustion instability, which made the engine fall apart during tests. So, why shouldn't we just dust off Apollo-era tech? Well, even though there's some buzz about bringing back old-school parts like the F-1 engine, recreating that technology isn't really practical. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. NASA's got its eyes set on fresh, cutting-edge tech to push space exploration into the 21st century. Big, single-use rockets are terrible for the environment and sustainability. That's why there's a big push towards reusable spacecraft. SpaceX is killing it with their reusable Falcon 9 rockets, and other companies like Virgin and Blue Origin are working on their own cool gadgets for various uses. NASA is also on the reusable train, especially with their Artemis missions. Thanks to new tech, we've already learned tons about space without even landing on the moon. Basically, we're on track to achieve all the Apollo mission's goals, but in a smarter, more efficient way. Another reason we don't just hop back to the moon is that it's incredibly tough. Sending people to the moon and bringing them back is one of the most ambitious projects ever. Out of all the space agencies today, NASA is still the only one that's actually landed astronauts on the moon. Even China's space agency, with its massive budget, hasn't managed it yet. And here's another twist. The moon isn't the same as it was when Neil Armstrong and his crew left it about 50 years ago. It's not just a dry, dusty rock like we thought back in 1969. Instead, it's got a lot of water, mostly frozen in craters near the poles. So when NASA sends astronauts back to the moon in the next few years, it'll be a whole new adventure compared to the Apollo missions. Back in 2010, President Barack Obama made a big push for NASA to look beyond the moon and set its sights on new destinations like asteroids and Mars. At the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, he said, "I just have to say pretty bluntly here, we've been there before. There's a lot more space to explore and a lot more to learn when we do." However, the game plan has shifted since then. Now, the United States has redirected its focus back to the moon as a key part of its exploration goals. So what do you think about this? Let us know in the comments section. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. While you're still here, click the video on your screen to see more interesting content like this one.